Okay, so we're backing up just a tad to the last unit to cover this for sake and completeness, and we need to talk about the different types of muscle fibers. And when we look at the different types of muscle fibers, we're going to focus in this class on really two different types. Now, I also want to explain to you that all the muscles that you have in your body have both types of muscle fibers in them. There really isn't a muscle that's 100% one type of muscle fiber. It might be 90 or 95% a certain type, but it's going to be a mixture of different muscle fiber types, and I'll explain why. But the first type is called slow muscle fibers. It has some other names, some other synonyms, nicknames like red muscle, slow oxidative, or type 1 fibers. And these names are actually because of different attributes or aspects about the muscle fiber. The characteristic of the slow muscle fibers, and they're labeled here as SO, and so this is a cross-section through muscle, skeletal muscle, and you can see that there are some pink-looking muscle fibers labeled FG that we'll get to next, the type 2 fibers, and the SOs that are these darker, they look brown, it's more of a dark reddish brown. And this is a stain that's used in this histology stain that actually identifies tissue and lights it up in this brown stain that has high density of mitochondria. And so the slow oxidative fibers are lighting up with this brown stain. There's more mitochondria in these, there's more myoglobin, and there's a dense amount of capillary network within these fibers. And the answer to the question, does anybody know why, or what the answer to that question is why does it have more of all of these things?
For sustained contractions.
So sustained contractions for a longer period of time, that's absolutely true. And it has something to do, there's another piece of data that I would like to add to that justifies why there's more mitochondria.
Because that's where it harvests their energy?
It harvests its energy using aerobic respiration. Okay? So aerobic respiration must have mitochondria present, because that's where it takes place. And it generates far more ATP. So you have a long energy supply, but does it take a short amount of time to manufacture the ATP or a slower amount of time? Slower or fast, sorry. It's slower to generate. So these are considered slow twitch fibers because they can't generate their energy really fast, but they can last for a long period of time. So these fibers are going to be like postural muscle fibers, or fibers that would be found in the gastroc, the quadriceps, or the hamstrings that are there in individuals that are like long distance runners, cross-country or marathon runners. Okay? So the red muscle is because of the staining, that's that name. Slow oxidative is because of the energy source that it uses. And then type 1 fiber is because it's one of the first fiber types that was actually identified. If we contrast this to the second type that we're going to cover, which is called type 2, we call it white muscle because it doesn't really stain with this reddish brown. It's not truly white in color, it's just less colored than the slow oxidative fibers with this particular stain. They're usually larger than the slow twitch, and they're called fast glycolytic. Now the word glycolytic kind of gives it away. Why would we say that they're fast glycolytic? Energy source, right? So it generates ATP very quickly, but it fatigues very fast. So it runs out of energy very quickly. It utilizes our treat and phosphate systems that we talked about for those short, less than 10-second spouts of activity that you need energy. And then it's going to also utilize the glycogen lactic acid pathways up to about 40 seconds. So these would be our sprinting type of muscles, and they're abbreviated here FGs. Now, how many of you are exercise science majors? So you're going to move on, and you're going to find an intermediate fiber type. This isn't the whole story, but for this 200-level course, This is kind of the introduction to the different fiber types. So you do see an intermediate that's kind of like the SUV, right? It actually has the ability to use both energy pathways. And its ability to generate volume and speed is right in between these two different types. But we're going to keep it simple for our purposes. And this is a figure that doesn't come from your textbook. But I want to use it to demonstrate the take-home point that I was making, that all muscles are going to have some composition or some mixture of multiple fiber types. And in this case, we're just looking at the two, the slow oxidative and the fast glycolytic, or the type 1 and the type 2. So this is actually out of quad muscle out of male athletes. Okay? And we're looking at slow oxidative, type 1, versus fast glycolytic, type 2. And you can see the average male individual is almost right down the middle, 50-50. But it's definitely, you know, a little bit skewed to the fast glycolytic fiber. And then these male athletes that are swimmers have more slow oxidative fiber type within the quad muscle group. Those that are marathon runners have 82% slow oxidative, but it's not 100%. It's 82% in 18, or 74 and 26. Okay? And then if you go down to sprinters and jumpers, again, it's skewed the other direction. 63% fast glycolytic and only 37% slow oxidative. And so here's one of the all-time favorite questions, right, to make you think, is do these individuals that have a predisposition, is it a predisposition to specific fiber typing, or is it training specificity that ends up pushing it in that direction?
Both.
Both? I can't trick you guys, huh? You guys got so smart by the end of the semester. So it's probably some combination of both, right? So it's the nature versus nurture question, right? Does the young athlete naturally have a fiber type disposition that's going to make them a better long-distance runner or a short sprinter? Well, yes, probably. And they probably try both, and then they naturally gravitate towards one, because either they like it better, or a coach sees something in them and says, you know what? You have the makings of a great sprinter. How do you know? Well, I've watched you, I know your times, I see how you run, you've got the right body composition, and then the training comes on top of that. Okay? Does it mean that there aren't athletes that can go and do both types of activities well? Yeah, of course there is. Okay? But it just gives you sort of this whole new realm within this exercise sports science that many of you are going to moving on in your careers to learn about. There is this nature versus nurture dichotomy, or kind of push and pull, and we're always trying to wonder which one has the more dominant contribution. So we see that there are adaptations to exercise where if you took the average Joe, okay, and you trained them one direction, it would push their fiber disposition the other way. If you train them the other way, it would push them the other way too. So we do know that training specificity has a big influence. And there are adaptations that come to exercise, like what you see here. Okay? This is before I started teaching. But muscle cells obviously are going to respond to exercise, and they're going to adapt. Muscle cells will enlarge in size, and that's a word called hypertrophy. Hypertrophic cells are enlarged cells. The red muscle is going to add more of the mitochondria and myoglobin. That's the slow oxidative, or the type 1 fiber. And if this situation happens with skeletal muscle, and we know that cardiac muscle is very similar to skeletal muscle. This is a little bit of a plug for my path class that maybe some of you will take. We see the same type of thing happen with the heart, cardiac muscle hypertrophy. So for example, if you weight lift, you know that the muscle cells of the skeletal system enlarge. Well, if you have a heart that has an increasing workload because of disease or hypertension, that cardiac muscle is also going to enlarge, and that's called a heart hypertrophy. And this is a disease state down here. Okay, some of you would say, that is too, Keller. Okay, there's something wrong with that guy.
Yeah.
All right. So we know that heart, cardiac, as well as skeletal muscle is going to enlarge with increasing loads or exercise. Now, why do they fail? As we kind of wrap things up, why do muscles fatigue? Well, muscle fatigue is very different that we're talking about. Physiologic fatigue is different than the psychological fatigue. Right? So there is a psychology of exercise and sports, and many of you will learn about that. And a lot of this is our barriers that we put in place ourselves, where we think that we can't continue on, we can't move on. Okay, and part of coaching and training is actually helping athletes to get beyond those barriers, those psychological barriers. But even if you move beyond the psychological barrier, there are ultimately physiologic barriers that will ultimately rear themselves, and you can't surpass them. So some of the possible explanations. Well, calcium. If calcium isn't preserved truly, okay, or pristinely, and you get leakage of calcium into the sarcoplasm, well, then you can actually have fatigue of the muscle in that way. You might run out of glucose or glycogen. Okay? A lot of long-distance runners or athletes that are doing long types of energy demand activities over long periods of time talk about hitting a wall, and that's where energies are starting to deplete, and there aren't any more readily available energy supplies. And so the body starts looking for other sources. Okay? So ATP shortage is in line with that. Glucose and these energy drinks and these bars and these gels are fast types of sugars. And for the long haul, the long run, it's usually the oxidative pathways that you're looking for. So you might even start burning fats and proteins, which is basically a process at some level of cannibalization, right? You're self-cannibalizing because you're trying to find sources of energy. So you start burning your own fat, you start burning your own protein or muscle. We see that this is an issue in diabetics. Okay? So if you move on, you take my path class, and we'll start talking about type 1 and type 2 diabetes. And we see that patients that don't have even homeostatic levels of glucose kind of have these waxing and wanings of when glucose is high and glucose is low. And they'll hit these walls or they'll bonk out and try to search for other sources of energy throughout their day. Not while they're running a marathon, but just because their insulin levels may not be in check. The other one is if you release a lot of potassium, that's going to lower the excitability of the membrane. Okay, so that can influence fatigue. What if you run out of neurotransmitter, acetylcholine? It's not recycling quite quick enough. Okay? All of these things should make sense based upon what you know already about muscle. These are all the places where it can run out of juice, so to speak. The last one, which there's a lot of talk about, a change in pH, like if you utilize a lactic acid producing pathway, won't the pH in the local muscle cause fatigue? And really the answer to that is probably not. And the reason for it, you'll learn more next semester, because you have this buffering system in your body. After you exercise, right, and even if you do a sprint, and you get done with your sprint, you sit there like this, you're breathing heavy even after you're done running. And the exercise is over, but you're still respirating quickly. What's going on there? Well, you're buffering off the acid. And so you buffer off the acid very quickly, and that's why you increase your respirations. Because this bicarbonate buffer system will take the pH, the free hydrogen ion, that influences pH and makes the tissue acidic, and it binds it to bicarbonate. It gets it into the bloodstream, out to the lungs, and then you exhale. And if you've ever tried to clean your phone or your glasses, and you go, you can see that not only is it CO2, you can't see the CO2, but you know that CO2 is being blown off. You can see the water vapor. So that bicarbonate and the free hydrogen ion is being exhaled as CO2 gas and water vapor. And that's how we buffer our pH. And you do that really, really quickly. So it's probably not the last one. But if we finish up with this oxygen death concept, which is this increase in breathing even after the exercise is stopped, which doesn't really make sense unless you think about why it's there. Why is the person breathing hard? They're done running, right? There's no more running. They shouldn't be breathing hard. Well, they're breathing hard because the body's trying to get rid of that excess pH, or that free hydrogen ion. Excess pH is the wrong term. Excess free hydrogen ion that lowers pH and makes it acidic. So it's trying to bring the pH back to a homeostatic level. And by breathing off water vapor and CO2, you raise the pH again. And that's from that lactic acid. That's from this lactic acid that turns into pyruvic acid. That can be converted back to glucose in the liver. And then you're also trying to replace any oxygen reserves. You're trying to reoxygenate myoglobin and hemoglobin because you might have stripped off those free phosphates in those phosphate donations to get your early energy. And then last but not least, you're replenishing any donations that came from creatine phosphate or any stripping of ADPs to make ATPs. So you're going to rephosphate those AMPs and get them back to ATPs. Okay? And that's why after you're done running or even just climbing the stairs, okay, you have an increase in respiration that doesn't really jive with what your energy expenditure is at that particular moment. All right. Muscles at rest. Which of the following is not associated chemically with the others? Muscles at rest. Which one is not associated chemically with the other? B?
Yes.
B. Right? Why?
Because it's not, because the other three make up the
What's that? No, because myosin isn't going to be associated with actin at rest, right? Because the tropomyosin is blocking the binding site. Okay? All right. So that concludes our last unit.